Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Bakhmut, where we have this geolocated footage by Riba, where we see the Russians have managed to make a small advancements here by the forest lines, by the railways, and have reached an front line that is approximate to this area. There's also reports that the Russians may have captured this area here, but I'm waiting for further confirmation for this part. But this would mean that the Russians have secured the southern flank of Avdiivka, and they'll likely pass on to the southern parts and here in the direction of Yar without any resistance coming from the north. If they have managed to secure this part, they'd also be able to launch further attacks within the village and advance further based on the security of the southern flank. And as such, we see that there is a developing situation here in the south of Avdiivka to the west of Khomove, as the Russian 98th Guards Air Assault Division is pushing onwards here in the northern flank of Bakhmut, likely in the direction of Yar and Ivanivska. Moving in a southern direction, there is this geolocated footage which confirms the Russians recaptured the trenches here to the west of Orlivka, and with this geolocated footage we see that the Russians have regained their positions here and some positional fighting is taking place, with Ukrainian shelling on these Russian positions following their withdrawal from the area after the Russians pushed them away. Further south in the direction of Avdiivka, we have some developments to the north and to the south of the city. In the northern parts, the Russians have moved a slight bit closer to the main supply line of the Avdiivka area for the Ukrainians, and they are now only 220 meters away from the supply line. We also see that there's a slight advance towards the train station here to the south of the Russian positions. And with this, we see that the Russians are getting closer and closer to completely physically cutting off the main supply line, as well as advancing to the main train station, which would solidify the control of the central parts of Avdiivka and allow the Russians to start attacking the citadel area from the north. Meanwhile, in the southern direction, there's been this advance by the Russians, which is actually very significant because this fortification here to the west of the residential area of Avdiivka is extremely important for the Ukrainians to hold on to. First off, it is the main supply route into this military base here to the south of it, which means if the Russians manage to capture it, then the Ukrainians would be completely cut off here to the south of it. But already with the foothold they currently have, there would be no supplies going through the roads here. This means that the Ukrainians have no roads to go to and from the military base, as the western one here has been cut off by the Russians, and the northern parts would be here in the face of the Russians. As such, there would be no supply routes through the roads, and both this fortification as well as the military base is now cut off from supplies. And if the Russians continue such an operation, especially with reports of fighting here to the southwest of the fighting area, this means that the Russians are likely looking to completely envelop this area, cutting off the Ukrainian soldiers from their supply lines and encircling them all. And that is what we're seeing right now with this attack on these positions, cutting off the supply lines and completely encircling the Ukrainian forces in the area. So with this, we see that the Russians have started a envelopment operation here to the south of Avdiivka, as per my scenario number 1 in the previous video, where I counted the 3 scenarios of the Battle of Avdiivka. We're seeing that the Russians are continuing exactly as I expected, which is that they are moving through the residential area as the Ukrainians are booby-trapping their way in a slight, slow withdrawal. As they send further reinforcements to the area, they are trying to slow down the Russians as much as possible as they prepare their own counterattack and regaining positions within Avdiivka. Because right now, the current situation is that the Ukrainians have no secure supply route in and out of Avdiivka, so it is very difficult for them to reinforce and send more reinforcements to the city itself, as well as resupplying it, which makes it very difficult for them to hold on to it. The Russians are currently trying to secure the southern flank, which would mean that the Ukrainians would simply have no chance at launching a counterattack in that direction, because the Russians would simply have all of these open fields and fortifications, likely planted minefields as well. Because based on some footage here in the north to the east of Avdiivka, where we have this geolocated footage, which shows a Ukrainian infantry fighting vehicle launching a counterattack here by the forest lines, and then it gets hit by a mine. The Russians just captured this a week ago, and there's already minefields there. This means that the area which the Russians have held onto for months now will definitely have tons of minefields and fortifications prepared by the Russians, and as such we can expect that the Ukrainians will have a difficult time launching a counterattack here to the south, while the northern flank is much more exposed. The Russian fortifications to the north are centered around the railway which goes from Novobakhmutivka to Novobakhmutivka here to the west and to the east, and they also have these forward positions ahead of the railways, and then there are multiple forest lines here to the north of Krasnodarivka that the Ukrainians would have to break through. But if they do launch an offensive operation towards Krasnodarivka and capture the village, or through the roads here to the north and go down to Kamyanka, they could cut off the Russian supply lines in the north, which would break the siege. However, this is a huge task for the Ukrainians to undertake, but it is also the most obvious area to attack because that is the most vulnerable area of the Russians, especially with what is at stake if the Ukrainians manage to succeed in such an assault. At the very least, they could redivert some of the supplies from going into the city to instead going to the flanks, which would ease the fighting in the city, and with additional reinforcements, they could break the siege through head-on attacks, which is more of the Zelensky style. So based on this, we see that the Ukrainians are preparing for a massive counterattack to break the siege, because that is what he himself announced. And at the same time, we're seeing that the Russians are slowly progressing and advancing, trying to capture the city before the Ukrainians are ready. This is why the Ukrainians within the city are trying to slow down the Russians as much as possible. To the south of Avdiivka, there is this development to the south of Marinka, where the Russians launched a small assault towards Pobeda. They're going through this secondary road instead of the main road to flank and expand the front line to storm Pobeda. They have previously held positions here to the east of Pobeda, which ended up being pushed back, and the Ukrainians recaptured the area. But now we're seeing a restart of operations now that the Russians have full control over Marinka and are fighting inside of Horivka. If the Russians manage to capture Pobeda, then the Ukrainians would have no forward positions in the north, and the Russians could launch attacks towards Konstantinivka or flank Horivka from the south. Either way, it opens up for more possibilities and more opportunities for the Russians if they capture Pobeda. Therefore, Pobeda is a very important village for them to start attacking. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are holding onto it very toughly. They're holding onto it for a long time, despite the Russian efforts to capture it, and that is due to the importance of the village. As for the Robotyne direction, there is this geolocated footage here to the west of Robotyne in the trenches, which shows positional fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians, as the Russians are trying to push in an eastward direction. This also confirms their positions here within the trenches, and as such we see that there are some efforts by the Russians here in the Robotyne direction to try and recapture some of the trenches and positions to the west of Robotyne before storming the village itself, as positional fighting is happening both to the south and to the west of Robotyne, but the Ukrainians are holding on to it with a lot of strength, and therefore we're not seeing very limited Russian success in the front line. We've seen no developments in the Robotyne front since the start of February. We then move on to the Krynki direction, where there has been this development where the Ukrainians have slightly expanded their foothold within the town, and we see that the positional fighting here continues, despite the Russians being very close to and storming the town multiple times. The Ukrainians still hold positions here within it, and this is likely due to the nature of the fighting. The Russians themselves claim that the fighting taking place here in the area is focused around giving the Ukrainians as many casualties as possible for as long as they keep resupplying and sending reinforcements to Krynki. And the Ukrainians are claiming that this is a potential future operation for them to get a foothold across the Dnieper River and start launching offensive operations here. Whichever is saying the truth will be seen in the future, as time will tell in the end who is right. But what we do see is that the fighting here is very tough for both sides, as heavy fighting and firefights are taking place all the time, with heavy bombardments of the town itself, as the Russians have a significant artillery advantage here. There's also a lot of counter-battery strikes taking place, where the Russians are striking deep into Ukrainian territory to attack all of the Ukrainian artillery units all throughout the Kherson direction. So we see that the Ukrainians are paying a very heavy price to try and get this foothold. But then again, if the Ukrainians do succeed on getting a foothold across the Dnieper River, then they could start offensive operations there, as long as they have the necessary units and preparations, equipment, and so on, which it doesn't really seem that they have right now. So this raises the question as to why they are attempting this in the first place. Finally, there are two additional topics to be talking about. The first one is the usage of Starlink by the Russian army. I actually received this news a couple of days ago, but I kept forgetting to talk about it. But pretty much it is that the Russians have bought Starlink systems from a third country, likely from the Middle East. The Middle Eastern country bought it and sold it to Russia. The Russians are now using it at the front line, deploying some of these Starlink systems for two reasons. The first one is to listen into Ukrainian conversations and their network. The second one is to overload the network to prevent the Ukrainians from communicating through the Starlink system. As such, they are jamming the Starlink system and listening in to Ukrainian conversations using these systems across the front line. This is also why Starlink at some point went offline in Avdiivka direction, because the Russians were overloading this system with their own system. Therefore, we're seeing that there is these significant developments with the communication of the Ukrainians here within Avdiivka due to this sabotage by the Russians. The second topic is the topic of the Ukrainian defensive lines. This video just came out showing the Ukrainian fortifications, just like they made a trailer for the Ukrainian offensive. Now they're also making a trailer for the defenses. We see multiple layers of trenches. We see some heavy vehicles building these fortifications. We see small scale, short range air defense systems. We see mobile infantry fighting vehicles, armored fighting vehicles, as well as tanks and air defense systems, mobile artillery, and so on, all the way from the border to Belarus and down to the Kharkiv region, as well as through the Donetsk region itself. All of these fortifications are built throughout the whole area since the start of the war until now, and this is why we're seeing multiple levels. We're also seeing some old footage, new footage, dragon teeth. So they're drawing inspiration from the Russians, as the Russians have built theirs in a similar manner with these anti-tank ditches and trenches, multiple layers of trenches, heavy minefields, and there's also a lot of other things. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians are definitely prepared if the Russians launch multiple offensives in multiple directions. The biggest issue for the Ukrainians is the lack of manpower, the lack of equipment, ammunition, and so on. If the Russians launch a too big of attack with too many forces, it doesn't matter how much fortifications the Ukrainians have if they cannot man everything. So Ukraine's fatal flaw is definitely the lack of ammunition and manpower. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.